So as I was thinking about preparing for this morning, it reminded me of the first chapel that we had after all those months of COVID lockdown. And I remember coming along and thinking, oh yeah, first chapel. And as soon as we started singing together, I just started crying. And I thought, the privilege of standing shoulder to shoulder with people who love Jesus and worshipping him, I'd kind of forgotten how special it was. And we never want to lose that sense of awe and privilege. So I just want to read a few words, a few verses from Psalm 95 before we enter into worship. Psalm 95, "O come, let us sing to the Lord. Let us make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation. Let us come into his presence with thanksgiving. Let us make a joyful noise to him with songs of praise. For the Lord is a great God and a great King above all gods. In his hands are the depths of the earth. The heights and the mountains are his also. The sea is his, for he has made it, and his hands formed the dry land. O come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord, our Maker, for he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture, the sheep of his hand."
Well, it's good to be here today. Good to start off a new semester with everybody. And I love the theme that Tim kicked off last week, this theme of unchanging. And these times in which we have been living in, we have certainly been through enough changes. And it's good to know that some things never change. Lately, I have been thinking a lot about homes. In 1991, my wife and I bought our first house in Los Angeles. There it is, at the corner of Elm and Laurel in Brea, California. And interestingly enough, I realized recently that during the years we have owned this home, it has been leased out to other people to live in more than we have lived in it. A few years later, after we bought this home, we lived there for about 6 years, and then we moved to China. This was our first home in China, up here on the 5th floor, right up in here. This was our, no kidding, our government-approved apartment on the 5th floor. We were given a choice, either this or the university housing where I was studying Chinese language. That's the way things were in China in those days. And after a while, we upgraded a little bit. We lived in this for a while, and then we moved to the top floor right here, 7th floor of this building. It's only a couple blocks away, but it was built while we were living in the other place. We lived there for a while. 149 steps from the ground floor to our apartment. Yes, I counted them because I would run up and down those steps more than once a day. And when you're living over 2,000 meters up in the mountains, it's a good exercise for the legs and the lungs, all of that. No elevator. We lived in China for nearly 9 years, and then we moved back to our home in Los Angeles, where I was completing my PhD and teaching at Biola University. And then nearly 8 years ago, we moved into this cute little place in Ringwood East. That's what it looked like when we first moved in. I think this was probably about the day we rented it, wasn't it, honey? It looks a little different now. Everything has grown up, and that's how it looks dressed up for Christmas time. Our home is still there in Los Angeles waiting for us someday, but it's not likely that we will move back anytime soon. At least we hope we don't move back anytime soon. I've been thinking a lot about homes lately because Sue and I are yet again in the process of applying for another visa. so that we can stay here in Australia for at least a few more years. For nearly 30 years now, visa applications have been a part of our life. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this, a visa is a document that allows a foreigner to live in another country, to travel or to work. And I took some time recently to reflect on the number of visas my wife and I have had, the numbers of years that we have had those visas as we have lived as aliens in other countries or traveled in other countries, usually for ministry purposes. Nearly half of our married life, we've been married 38 years, nearly half of that we have lived in other countries other than our home in the United States. It has been both a delight, but it has had its challenges. As those of you who have lived in other cultures know, it has its challenges. And so here we are yet again in this process of another visa application, and it brings to my mind a question that I have asked so many times over the years. Where is my true home? That's not a hypothetical question for us. Our son answered that question, and he moved back to America, and he said to us one day, "Mom, Dad, this place makes no sense to me." Typical third culture kid. So he chose a home that was different from China, different from America. He lives in Taiwan, which is China or not, depending on who you ask. Just last week, I was watching a video of a missionary who has lived for the past 15 years in Ukraine. He's an Australian, but he has a Ukrainian wife, and they have 3 kids. And he was reflecting on the effects of war over the past year and showing pictures of homes that have been destroyed, and the thousands of refugees that have fled to other countries to find safety and security and to try and rebuild a home. According to the United Nations Refugee Agency, there are currently nearly 90 million people worldwide who have been forcibly displaced from their homes. This includes refugees, internally displaced, asylum seekers. Every day the news is filled with such stories of people who flee from one country to another in search of a home, a place where I can be safe, where I can live my life. And all of this has caused me to reflect on this yet again, this very simple but sometimes very difficult question to answer. Where is my true home? What does it mean to be at home? In my reflections, God has taken me yet again to one of those passages of Scripture that has become an anchor point for me over these years. When the theme of unchanging was decided on for this chapel series, I knew exactly where I was going to go. Because this has been one of those passages that I have lived in for all these years. One of those anchor passages for me that has held me secure amidst all these changes of my life. Psalm 90. Psalm 90 begins with this line: Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. This is the only psalm we have that was written by Moses, but the fact that he penned these words I find enormously significant. Because when we think back over the history of God's people, the history of these people that Moses has led now for all these years, these words take on a depth and a meaning and a substance, don't they? You see, the theme of homelessness and the theme of seeking a home is written all through the Old Testament. You go back to Abraham, who God had called from Ur of the Chaldees, and he was a nomad, and God led him on a very circuitous route to the area that we now know as Israel. And then through a severe famine, God's people wind up in Egypt, which initially was a place of safety and a place of refuge, a home where they could settle and be safe. But over time, that place of safety and refuge becomes a prison of slavery. And ultimately, through Moses, God leads his people out to freedom, and through 40 years of wilderness wandering, and then to the border of the promised land. And now at the end of his life, Moses reflects back over these years. And I don't think he just looks back over the years of his own life. I think he's looking back over the history of God's people. And he writes these words, Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Interestingly, Moses speaks these same words at the end of Deuteronomy as he is going back again over the history of God's people, and his final words of blessing to the people of Israel. Just before his death, Moses reminds them, the eternal God is your dwelling place, and underneath are the everlasting arms. What does it mean that God is our dwelling place? Augustine makes the observation that God is our fatherland. He is our homeland. One of the themes of Augustine's Confessions centers on this image of homecoming. And really, it's not just woven through his Confessions, it's through his other writings as well. God waits for the soul to come back to its true home with him. And without that home in God, nothing in life has any meaning at all. Because, as Augustine says, the soul is only at home in God. And because there and there alone can we truly be ourselves in the love and in the knowledge of God. The only way I can possibly know myself is in this depth of this relationship with God. Knowing God is the pathway to discovering myself. In the same way, Moses reminds these people, as he reminds us, that our deeper identity is not in a place. Our deeper identity is in God. Our security is not in ourselves. Our security is in God. And so Moses and Augustine confront us with this one question: what is a home? What do we mean by home? What does it mean to find my home in God? A home is that place where we discover and shape our identity. This is where I form a sense of who I am and what I am all about in life and in this world. I am born into a family with a history, which gives me a sense of place, which gives me a sense of purpose in this world. And all through the Old Testament, we find God's people in search of a home where they can settle, where they can live, where they can flourish, and find that place of security, find that place of meaning and purpose. But out of the depth of his reflection, Moses utters these words, "Lord, you have been our dwelling place in every generation." What forms my true sense of identity? Not Egypt or slavery, not wilderness wandering or promised land, not America or China or Australia or any other nationality. You see, the substance and the fullness of who I am is rooted deeply in this unchanging person and presence of God himself, who is with me in every one of those circumstances. The things and the places of this life and this world are constantly changing, but the one constant, the one unchanging being throughout eternity, God, is with me. From everlasting to everlasting, he is God. And nothing in this earth or in this life can change that. Amidst all the uncertainties and inconstants, and I've been around long enough to have seen many uncertainties in my life, God is the one constant thing. That is where our soul lives and rests and finds its life and its substance and identity. I have picked up my suitcase and moved house from one side of the planet to the other a few times. But my real dwelling place, my true home, my true identity are not found in a location, but in the person and presence of God himself. Moses likely wrote this psalm at the end of his life. And it is a psalm of contrasts, a psalm that depicts the eternal greatness of God alongside the frailty of human beings. Notice how Moses describes the majesty of God in verse 2. He is the creator of all things. He formed the earth. He has given life to everything in the world. And in saying that, we realize that all of creation displays something of the creative genius and the power of God. And Moses tells us that God is eternal, from everlasting to everlasting. But contrasted with the God who is eternal, Moses reflects on the frailty and the transience of people. While God is eternal, our time on earth is temporary. Look at verse 3. You return man to dust, and you say, return, O children of man. Verse 10, the years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength, 80. Yet their span is but toil and trouble, and they are soon gone, and we fly away. 70 years used to seem old to me. It's not that far away. I realized this morning as I was thinking about this, if I died at the age of my grandfather passed away, I have less than 10 years left. That'll clear your head. Well, Moses describes God as the creator of these majestic mountains. Humans are compared with the grass that comes and goes, fades away with the seasons. Our home in Los Angeles ought to tell you something. It sits near a web of earthquake faults. We have permanent cracks in our walls, which we patch up from time to time, but it doesn't take long before they're back. The ground around us is constantly shifting and moving. I have been through more earthquakes in my lifetime than I can count. And it's a reminder that this house will not stand forever. Someday it'll be torn down and rebuilt. But that word for dwelling place there in verse 1 could also be translated as refuge. Lord, you have been our refuge in all generations. In our frailty, we have a sure refuge in our eternal God. The world can be swept away in an earthquake or a flood or a fire, but God is our refuge. And we also see that God is holy, but we are broken and we are sinful. Comes out in a number of ways through this psalm. God is pictured as a judge, which is an expression of his holiness, his perfection, that he is able to judge sinful people. And we live under his discipline, his sovereignty, but we are not only frail, but the world that we live in is broken. It is fallen. And the reality of that chases us through the days and the years of our lives. It's interesting, I have noticed over the years how many people form an identity out of their failures and their brokenness more than their successes. How many people I have met, the first thing they say, hello, I'm your Asperger's. Hi, my name is so-and-so and I'm an alcoholic. Hi, my name is Evelyn. I'm divorced. Never mind that she was also the first vice president of a university, first woman vice president of a university. But the first thing I knew about her was that she'd been divorced 20 years. How often do we form an identity out of our failures, our brokenness, our places of sinfulness, whatever that is? And so Moses frames this psalm as a lament, a plea for God's mercy in the midst of life's hardships and our sinfulness. And so the psalm helps us to reflect on two of life's most important questions. First, what forms the substance of my identity? Who am I really? And am I trying to form that sense of identity in God or in something else? As Augustine reflected earlier, our identity must be formed in relation to our unchanging God. And second, what ultimately gives my life meaning and purpose. And that's what forms his prayer here at the end of this psalm. First, he asks for a heart of wisdom. Verse 12, teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom. Wisdom is birthed, as we see here, out of the honest and sober reflection on the greatness of our God, his holiness, his eternal nature, and his creative power, and our condition as broken, frail, sinful, yet very redeemable people. These kinds of reflections ought to grow in us a heart of wisdom as we view all of life through the lens of God's truth and we see things through his perspective. And second, he asks for a deep contentment in the joy and the love of God. Verse 14, satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Remember those words of Augustine who said, you made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they come to rest in you. I love those words of Teresa of Avila, who reflects, if I have you, God, I will want for nothing. The only thing that can secure that kind of contentment is joy. Contentment and joy is a heart that is satisfied with the experience of God's love. And third, he asks for work that is meaningful and enduring. These final verses bring these contrasts together into a beautiful reflection. Let your work be shown to your servants and your glorious power to their children. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us, and establish the work of our hands upon us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. God, let us see your eternal work, and let your favor rest upon us. In the light of our human transience, give us an eternal spiritual heritage. The greatest legacy any one of us can leave is a spiritual legacy, pointing people to Jesus. By God's grace, our influence will continue long after we're gone. My greatest desire in life is not to build a monument to myself or any other person. My greatest desire is to leave a legacy of faithfulness. Let this work endure generation after generation, even after I'm gone. Just last week, my wife and I got an email from a dear friend in the States. Rich and Ruth were missionaries in Congo for many years, and we had the privilege of spending time with them not only in California, but in their home in Congo. And during their years there, they had to flee from their home more than once because of political uprisings, tribal warfare, and a very unstable society. But they always returned, and they continued serving the people that God had called them to serve. Ruth was a medical doctor, yet even as a doctor, she suffered for years with muscular dystrophy, which is a progressive and disabling disease. In their mid-70s, they finally returned to the States permanently. Rich wrote to us last week to say that Ruth had just passed away. Married for well over 50 years, Ruth was in her 80s, and she had spent her entire life serving other people, pointing them to Jesus. Even in her final years, as her body was failing, she taught and mentored young women and cared for others with whatever strength she had. Rich wrote, her final words summed up the real substance of her life. Ruth said, Jesus, I love you, and I'm ready to go home. And she left. Let's pray. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in every generation. And we thank you for your faithfulness to us, even in our brokenness, even in our rebellion. You and you alone are our true home. Help us to find that place of quiet rest near to the heart of God.